And hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and happy 4th of July to everyone around the world. It's a day to celebrate freedom, and thank you for joining us here. I'm so glad to have Harley Schlanger back. We were unable to meet 2 weeks ago, so it's been almost a month since we got together, and I'm really got a lot to talk about. I'm sure there's a lot on Harley's agenda too. So let's say hello, Harley, and where would you like to start this morning?
Hi, John, and happy birthday, America. Let's see if we can make it to 250 years.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're limping along right now. It's well, I guess I'll start then with Douglas McGregor, a retired U.S. Army colonel who has been making an awful lot of appearances on social media with various people of higher reach, far higher reach than I have. He's been one of the people that are referenced by the LaRouche organization from time to time. And I was watching him yesterday, and I saw that he said in response to a question that he didn't think we're going to make it to the next election, the 2024 election. And beyond that, then towards the end of the show, the announcer, I can't remember his name, I apologize, but said something that sounded like, well, that doesn't sound too good. And McGregor says, well, actually, it makes me happy. I think that's where we need to go. That's the solution. That's pretty chilling. I don't think that it's very cheerful to suggest that we're not going to have an election in 2024, and then to say that, well, that's a good thing. We need to go in a different direction, especially as a retired Army guy. So it's kind of well, what do you think? I don't know if you noticed the remark or heard him say that, but
Yeah, I did.
how stands the Republic now? Are we going to make it 250 years, or are we on our last legs?
Well, I think McGregor was saying it partly for shock value, because he's been pointing out that when you have all the leaders of a country saying the same thing and the population knows they're lying, that's not how a republic can function. And that was what he was referring to. The broader context for this was what happens when you have leaders who don't tell the truth and media that reinforces the lies, and the consequences fall on the people who can least afford it, namely the vast majority of the population. And then he's also looking across the ocean at France, where you see, there's no question that there's a certain element of racism in this response in France, just as in many of the riots in the United States, Black Lives Matter and so on, that they were triggered by violence against people of color. But what's the real story in France? There are two aspects to it. One is young people have no sense of a future, especially if you're from the former French colonies, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Indochina. They've reached a situation where younger people don't have confidence that they'll have a stake in the system. And the other part of it is that we've had a series of crises in France, including the yellow vests, which started because of the high price of fuel. Then you had the crisis with the pension reform, where Macron said, we can't afford to let you retire at 62. You have to wait till you're 64. And then you had this current episode, and what's the common denominator? No one trusts the government in France. And while some people are rallying around the police forces of the government, this is a classic trick when a government's in trouble. Use chaos or violence as a means of pushing ahead the power of the security state. Now, I did an interview with someone the other day, Alex Kreiner. I don't know if you know him. He's a Croatian who lives in Monaco. He's a financial manager, a blogger. But he made some very interesting points. He said that Macron has been sort of on the fence recently on a number of things. That is, on the one hand, he's still with the NATO war in the Balkans. I'm sorry, in Ukraine. On the other hand, he's not so strong for it. He's made some comments about the need for a peace agreement. He was gung-ho for cutting off China. Then he went to China and came back and said we shouldn't cut off China. There's a fight going on in the French elite. Macron is not his own man. He's a product of the French bankers, Lazard Frere, the Rothschilds, and others. And he's trying to manage a situation which is in big trouble. And Alex Kreiner said he thinks that this is part of the bigger war within the establishment over which side is going to come forward. And so the chaos has been allowed to continue. Behind the chaos, there are calls for a crackdown, like a post 9/11 security state. Of course, France already has a security state. But the bigger picture here is all of Europe is going through this. In Germany, the head of the largest utility company yesterday said the current German energy policy will lead to the total deindustrialization of Germany. Wind and solar will not provide enough electricity for Germany to remain an industrial nation. And you have comments like that coming from all sorts of people in Germany. 13% of all manufacturing firms have left the country in the last year. And another 30% are looking at their options. So Europe is in a mess. Now, in the United States, what do we have? The prospect of a Biden-Trump presidency. The one reason people are intrigued by that is it will be very brutal, I think. Spectator sport. But there's another matter here, which is that we have an opportunity perhaps to undo 60 years of control by an establishment which shouldn't be allowed to control anything, namely the corporate globalists, the ones who are for perpetual war because they profit from it, the ones who are against national sovereignty because they don't want countries to assert their rights to defend the people. And so we're seeing a split in the fabric of every society. And the problem is that no one is coming forward, or few people are coming forward with solutions. And that's our job. We're the solutions people. We're trying to give people a sense that instead of panicking about de-dollarization, use it as a way to take the power away from the corrupt cabal that's been running things. And that can be done through perfectly legal means, a Glass-Steagall restoration, your famous Glass-Steagall. With Glass-Steagall, you have a capacity to essentially take the power away from the leading banksters. For the other part of the solution is the United States should join with the global South, with Russia and China, and dump the existing monetary system, which doesn't work. It only works for a handful of billionaires. So there are solutions. There's a lot of chaos. I think people should be very worried. And I think McGregor is simply pointing out that it's possible that 2024 will turn into a period of total chaos. But I would say we have to use all of our creative energies to make sure that not only is it not a cancellation of the election, but that there's a real serious debate about the nature of the crisis and the future of the country. And not only in the United States, but there are elections coming up in Germany and other countries as well, where this crisis can be used as an opportunity to change direction.
Well, I don't know how we're going to dismantle the existing monetary system, but I do see that is where the problem lies. I just would, I hate to push back, but look, as I've studied these institutions of, like Murder Inc. and Perm Index and the Mafia, and going back into the 19th century as that your organization has really exposed in the book Dope Inc. and other ways, um, they work hand in hand with the bankers.
Yeah.
And so, when you say we're going to change the monetary system, they're likely to call Big Mike on the phone and say, "Hey, this guy's talking crazy. You do something about it." And I think Big Mike is pretty active in this world right now, and has all kinds of tools in his toolkit to take care of people that are talking like that. You guys, in fact, a number of you, including yourself, are on this hit list from the Ukrainians. And who are the Ukrainians but a bunch of oligarchs and people that are connected directly to organized crime as well as to NATO. So this combination of tentacles, both above board and under the table, are grasping onto everything and everybody at once, while we're distracted with everything else. We're distracted. The Ukraine war could be seen as a distraction. All of these riots in France could be seen as a distraction. When you consider, where did these immigrants come from in the first place? Why didn't they stay home? Well, they didn't stay home because of the financial system, because of the monetary system coming in with its monetary policies that are basically geared to screw the people and rip off the resources. So their countries have already fallen to the global elite, and so the lucky ones have been able to flee to Italy or France or somewhere else. And now it looks to me like this is a pre-planned thing, that it's not just a bunch of folks that happen to be Muslims that are exerting themselves as a separate people with rights and everything. No, I think these are just, as I saw, mostly kids like 12 to 17 years old who were getting arrested for firebombing police cars and things like that. These guys must be getting organized by agents provocateurs, to put it mildly. I don't see anybody gaining from burning down police stations and public buildings, except for ultimately whoever wants to create that chaos, the chaos to destroy, and in the chaos to come in, with your Lazare Frere and rebuild.
Well, that's the people behind the scenes don't mind the chaos. Now, the question is, do they have a coherent strategy that they think can win? Now, I can tell you that one aspect of their pre-planning, to the extent they pre-plan, is that they're intending to destroy the military power of Russia. And they thought they could do that. Now, if you actually look at the discussion going on in the leading think tanks, and by leading think tanks, I mean like the Royal United Services Institute, which is the oldest military think tank in the United Kingdom, totally tied to the monarchy. Chatham House, the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Heritage Foundation, left, right, it doesn't matter. What's their strategy? They're unified in one thing, which is that Russia has to be taken out of the equation as a military power, because Russia can't be brought under control. And I know there's some people out there who are saying, well, Putin was a young leader of the World Economic Forum and, blah, blah, blah. It's just not true. They're out to destroy Russia. That's the intention. They say it. Lloyd Austin said it. He didn't say destroy, he said weaken. There are people in Congress, people like Lindsey Graham, who said Russia's got to be humbled and beaten down. So part of their plan is to finish off Russia. It's not going to work with Ukraine. It's going to have, they're having an effect on Russia. But part of the effect has been that Russia has been able to organize their economy more effectively to fight better. And then just the other day, there was this meeting between Xi Jinping and Putin, where they recommitted to the common alliance for a change in the economy. Now, then some people say, well, China, didn't they go to Davos? Don't they have connections to Gates and these others. Yeah, but the one thing China will not do is they will not give up their sovereignty. And that's the centerpiece of the Klaus Schwab operation. So when you say it's all planned, there is planning. I'm not saying you, but when people say that, there is planning. There are strategies at work here. But I don't think they're very well thought out, and they won't succeed. And we can see that in terms of this whole question of the counteroffensive. All the weapons that have been provided have not done what they expected. The Leopard tanks from Germany are getting destroyed in the field. The Bradley vehicles, some of these systems, the French air system, they're not working. In fact, NATO is, if this is an advertisement for NATO war manufacturing, it's not a very good one. So what's left? Well, this is where the danger comes in. What's left is their belief that they could win a nuclear war. And this is something that the late Daniel Ellsberg kept warning about in his book about the doomsday machine, the world of the nuclear planners. And he said, I wrote this book because I was one. We planned out, how do you win a nuclear war? And to the extent that they actually try to do something like that, that could risk the annihilation of the human race. So I'm not so impressed by the fact that these guys have plans and they're trying to implement their plans. The question is, can we get together? Can we organize the vast majority of the population to upset their plans, to take the power away from them? We had an opportunity to do that in 2016, but most people were not sufficiently educated enough as to what the real fight was. And that includes Donald Trump, who made some terrible mistakes in terms of manpower, bringing in the 3 generals, bringing in Mnuchin, bringing in that other guy from Goldman Sachs for the economic policy. I think it was named Cohen. In any case, they didn't have a counter strategy. And then what got substituted was the QAnon, that don't worry, there is a plan. The white hats are behind the scenes and they're going to win. That's how we get manipulated, like a Hollywood movie set. The only way to win this fight is for people who want to defeat this oligarchy is to figure out who they are and what the alternative is. And we've been working on that for 50, 60 years. That's what Lyndon LaRouche's life's work was about. And why do you think they slandered LaRouche and did everything they could to destroy our organization? So we wouldn't be here when we got to this crisis. But we're here. We're at a moment in the crisis which is extremely dangerous for the human race, but we have some solutions. And I don't see any other solution at this point out there that will work. Chaos, anarchy won't work. Submission won't work because they won't stop until they kill off half of the human race. So we've got to get together and strategize and come up with plans to scare the hell out of anyone in public office who's not going to break with this whole globalist scheme.
Wow. Scare the hell out of anyone in public office. How do you scare a Steny Hoyer? How do you scare a Joe Biden? How do you scare a Lindsey Graham, as you mentioned? And folded into that is what you said reminds me of what McGregor was saying about how the military just wants to get into something without a plan, but they say that they'll make the plan when they get in.
Yeah.
And then they promise everybody that they've got a plan. So, they say, well, we've got to go into Vietnam. Well, what are we going to do when we get there? Oh, we have a plan. They didn't have a plan. They just put 400,000 guys in there and told them to go out in the jungle. From there forward, we've got a plan. We're going to send the Mujahideen. Oh, what happens next? And one of the things that really was resonant was, the idea of how did World War II end? And, okay, you destroy Germany, then what? what happens? Who fills the void? And it looks to me like that is the Cold War, is to try to forestall the natural event, which would have been Eurasia. That Eurasia would have been the natural result of World War II. And that when you see the Kissinger crowd and the Rockefellers fighting against Eurasia, why did they put so much money and energy into controlling every aspect of Western Europe after the war, except for that, they had seen and they had read the Mackinder books like everybody else had and said, if we don't control Western Europe, Russia's going to control it. And not only is that the fact, but it's the natural process. And it reminds me of Orwell's three countries in
That's
his.
John. That's precisely the point.
Yeah,
If you create mythologies so that people don't know what would be the principled basis for an alliance, then you can use an enemy image that you can concoct. And that's what's been done now with Russia and Ukraine. And people in the United States are given night after night lies, brainwashing. And if all these things are going on that are so bad, why don't they have video? Why don't they actually show us what's going on? The fact is, people have become accustomed to believing something that they hear from certain sources. But here's the point I would make. I wouldn't say that we can definitely win this fight. There's a real possibility we're going to see the human race annihilated in a nuclear war if these guys aren't stopped. Now, someone has to say that and be credible in it. And recently, we've seen other people saying that. McGregor said it. Jeffrey Sachs, who's not one of my favorite people, but he's been very good recently. He's said it. Tulsi Gabbard yesterday came out and said it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is saying that we're facing nuclear war. Now, then you have the New York Times and others who say, oh, that'll never happen. The Russians are more reasonable than that. Well, you just said the Russians are barbarians. Why do you now say they're too reasonable to launch a nuclear war? Well, Putin hasn't. Putin has been extremely patient. It's our side, the West, that's been pushing the envelope toward war. So I think the first thing is people who know what we know, and McGregor's done the same thing, Scott Ritter, the same thing. People who are becoming more trusted than anyone in the mainstream media, Tucker Carlson, are saying the same thing. These lunatics are pushing us toward nuclear war. Now, once people get that and think it through, and I know talking to you, you grew up in the Cold War. I'm assuming you have some memories, if not from childhood, at least from studying what the Cuban Missile Crisis looked like, what the 1982-83 missile crisis in Europe looked like. That there were moments where we could have obliterated the human race. And in some cases, we were lucky that it didn't happen. Now, in 62, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were lucky that John Kennedy was able to launch a back channel operation to prevent a nuclear war from occurring. And then what did he do? He came out with a different strategy. He came out with a strategy for peace. We should listen to the Russians. We should talk with them. We shouldn't hate them, even though we have different systems. And for saying that, he was killed. Now, that's had a huge impact on every politician that's come since then. When I say scare the hell out of the Congress, I mean something specific. They're already scared that if they break with the corporate globalists, that they'll be slandered, they'll be smeared, they'll be possibly targeted for assassination. But look what happened on January 6th. That was not a full-blown insurgency by a long shot. And look how terrified they were just by having people come into the Capitol. Now, think about the anti-war movement in the 60s and 70s, where we had millions of people in the streets of the United States, where it became clear to a lot of these guys that they're not going to get elected unless they get out of the Vietnam War. That's what we have to have now. We have to have a mobilization of people who understand the crisis, the nature of the enemy, and the fact that we represent the alternative. We represent the solution. That's what John Kennedy was saying in 1963. Between June 10th and the day he was assassinated, he was mobilizing to crush the war hawks, to come up with a strategy to outflank them, to prevent the war in Vietnam that was building, and in the meantime, to organize the population toward a policy of peace. The problem, as LaRouche said many times to myself and some of our associates, he should have been more public in what he was doing. Instead of fighting it as cabinet warfare, he should have been going on the television every night, saying to people, I'm pushing this policy of a test ban treaty. I'm negotiating with Russia and Cuba because I want your children to have good lives. And the people I'm fighting in the military-industrial complex want us to have a war so they can get rich. Now imagine, with the eloquence of Kennedy that we saw in the June 10th, 1963 speech, had he done that, had he gone the extra step. He didn't. So we have to pick up that to use his language, the torch has been passed to us. And we have to find in ourselves the courage to tell the truth about the crisis, the dangers, but also where the solutions lie. And that's where I see people like, I see Trump falling short on that. He didn't do it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is actually saying some very interesting and provocative things. He needs to clear up a couple of things that he has that are in the background there that are holding him back. Like, I would suggest he's got to start focusing more on the British. The Russians are focused on the British. McGregor is now focusing on the British. But the British are the ones who are pushing the envelope toward nuclear war in Ukraine. So there are things that can be done, but I think we have an opportunity with Trump, who's not going to be silenced. I don't care if they put him in a deep dungeon somewhere. He's still going to find some way to get a message out. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Trump, the two of them as candidates, create the room. Not necessarily, they don't have all the solutions, but they create the room for the discussion. That's what we haven't had in this country for a long time. If you talk the way I've been talking for the last 10 minutes, they call you a conspiracy theorist and a nut and a wacko. You know what? A lot more people are beginning to say, I want to hear what these guys are saying. So we have to have the courage to keep waging that fight, John. There's nothing else we can do. An armed revolution isn't going to succeed. The possibility of the military falling apart is another option. The kind of things that are being done with the military today doesn't give you a lot of confidence in them. The fact that NATO is unable to put together a strategy to break through the lines of Russia when they say the Russian army is incompetent. I think a lot of the power centers in the world are breaking down. So that's why we have an opportunity if we speak loudly and organize like hell.
Yeah, that 5G warfare is, information warfare, and that includes blatantly lying and doing it over and over and over again. And they're practicing that on us through the media that they control.
So you mentioned Orwell. That's what they learned from Orwell.
Yeah, and Orwell, I think, also, is saying that there becomes these three continental bodies in which North America and Britain are stuck together, but Eurasia has happened, and Russia and Europe are all together, and then there's Oceania, which is, I think, probably dominated by China in his conception of what 1984 would look like. I think we're headed in that direction, the three big powers. But in Douglas McGregor's comments the other day, I noticed that he said that Britain does what America says, and that reminds me of remember Tony Brown being Bush's puppy dog, and
Blair.
Blair, right? I'm sorry, Tony Blair. Thank you, Blair being the puppy dog. And a lot of people, especially I notice a lot of my Canadian friends are very much convinced that it's America that's wagging the dog and not the city of London. And I think from what Colonel McGregor said, he sees it that way too, that America does call the shots and Britain does what it's told. Uh, that's an interesting variation of views. How do you see it?
Well, I'll tell you why people see it that way, because they are accustomed to believing that the United States is the power, because the United States had the military power and the financial power that Britain doesn't have. So the idea is that Britain lost the empire, but they were smart enough to latch on to the United States. Now, what that misses is 150 years of history. We were actually almost 300 years of history. Who did we fight our revolution against? What were the issues in that revolution? It was sovereignty. It was the right to control your own credit system and financial system. You know, it's sometimes reduced to a tax revolt, but it wasn't just a tax revolt. The American Revolution was a revolt against oligarchy. And the British fought back with everything they had. When they lost the Revolutionary War, they kept at it. They were impressing sailors. They were continuing to carry on the battle to subvert Europe. They were very happy to see Napoleon march against Russia because, as you know from Mackinder a century later, the British idea was always you cannot allow an alliance between Western Europe and Eurasian countries centered around Russia. So if you look at the actual strategy that's being played out, the issue is not so much who's organizing it, it's what is the method that's being used. It's the old British imperial method, the British divide and conquer geopolitics. Now, why do we say the British are the drivers? Well, look at Biden. He can't drive anything. Look at people like Blinken and Sullivan and Avril Haines and the people making US policy, Susan Rice. How many of them studied in England, are Oxford scholars, have connections to this European oligarchy? Almost all of them. That's where they learned how to approach foreign policy. As Kissinger said at Chatham House in 1982, I believe it was, in my incarnation as Secretary of State, I use British briefing documents. You know, it was Blair, it was Richard Dearloffe, who were the champions of the idea of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and urged Bush Jr., who is not the brightest bulb in the chandelier, that he had every right to go after Saddam Hussein. So the strategy, the strategic impulse, is not an American system impulse. The American system was essentially always opposed to the idea of an empire. And I'm just preparing a speech for a conference this weekend in France on Kennedy and the American anti-imperial tradition. And it's very fascinating if you look at the June 10th speech and then look at what Kennedy did from then to the end of his life. He was mobilizing everything he could to break the power of this oligarchy. At the same time he gave the June 10th peace speech, he issued Executive Order 11110 that was an attack on the Federal Reserve's sole power to determine monetary and credit policy. He went with the civil rights movement. On June 11th, he embraced them as a way of breaking the old power centers, because who were the forces of slavery and racism? It came initially from the British and the British colonies in the South and Boston. So then you go back and you say, well, did Kennedy change because of Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the fights he had over the Bay of Pigs with the Dulles brothers and others? Well, sure, that's part of it. Kennedy did change to the extent that he suddenly came to realize he's president, and if he doesn't do something, we're going to end up getting blown up in a nuclear war. But you go back to Kennedy in 1951, when he had just been elected to the US Congress. he did a fact-finding mission in Vietnam and Thailand and Laos. And then in 1954, he gave a speech before the US Congress on Vietnam. And what he said is that, yes, we want to stop communism. We know it needs unified action. But the communists are strong because they're viewed as the anti-colonial, anti-imperial force. And he basically asks the question, why are we supporting imperialism when that's not our tradition? And 1 month after he gave that speech, where the US was supporting the French war against Ho Chi Minh, the French surrendered at Dien Bien Phu, and Kennedy's warning turned out to be true, that if you want to fight an insurgency that's popular and everywhere, it would require so much weapons and so many men that it couldn't succeed. And what happened? They killed them and then sent in 550,000 American soldiers, brought in the Aussies, some of the Brits and others, and still lost. Because you can't defeat colonialism, even if you have, anti-colonial forces, even if you have that kind of firepower. You can kill 1 million or more people, but you can't win the war. Then in 57, he gave a speech on Algeria, where he said basically the same thing. He said, he talked about talking to an Algerian who said, why is the United States acting against its national interests and national history, national tradition? So you see in these two speeches, Kennedy was clear that as an imperial enforcer, the United States couldn't succeed. And that's what he took with him when in 62, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Joint Chiefs and the CIA were pushing for a huge conflagration in Indochina. And in many of these books, there's one over my shoulder, Kennedy's Last 100 Days. Have you read that one?
No, I don't think I have. Who wrote it?
What's his name? It's an incredible book.
On the shoulder.
Yeah, Thurston Clark.
Okay. No, I
It's
haven't
an
read that.
incredible book. It goes through what happened after the June 10th speech until his assassination. And it's really quite amazing to see the discussion going on behind the scenes. Kennedy was the only one who said the United States, of his advisors and his immediate coterie, the only one who said we should get out of Vietnam instead of sending more troops in. At that time, there were 15,000 American military advisors. Kennedy sent Maxwell Taylor, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Robert McNamara, who Kennedy said was the only other person who agreed with him that we shouldn't fight a war in Asia. And then he consulted with Eisenhower. He consulted with MacArthur. MacArthur said a land war in Asia is insane. And so Kennedy brought this back to the cabinet, and he kept being told, oh, no, we've got enough power. We can win this fight. And the generals and the CIA were saying, look, we're winning. We're succeeding. All we got to do is get rid of the president of Vietnam because he's not really with us. And of course, there was a coup, November 1st, 1963, that ended up killing the president and his brother-in-law, or his brother. Now, who ran the coup? Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the ambassador at that time in Vietnam, who's part of the British faction in New England. And Lodge was working with all the war hawks, including the Dulles brothers and others. At that time, Foster was dead, but Allen Dulles was still pushing this war scenario. So Kennedy fought them. And he was prepared to what he kept saying is to his advisors, make sure we win the election in 64, because we're going to take 1,000 troops out at the end of this year, 1,000 out of 15,000 at the end of 63, and then all of them after the election in 64 if I win. So that was Kennedy's strategy. And what happened? Well, they knew that was a strategy and they killed him. There was something called the National Security NSAM 263, which National Security Action Memo 263, which specified 1,000 troops out of Vietnam by the end of the year. And after he was killed, 2 days later, they changed it to NSAM 273, which did not call for the withdrawal of troops, but then said that the CIA should work with the South Vietnamese army to launch covert actions in North Vietnam. Now, what did that lead to? The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which became the excuse for the massive deployment of troops. So the killing of Kennedy was an extraordinarily important moment in destroying this potential to restore the American system. And I think Kennedy had some elements of that in his thinking. It was not fully developed. I think working with Sorensen in particular, there were ideas there that could have changed the course of history. And instead, the course of history was changed by assassins' bullets. So what's the lesson from this? Well, what very fascinating, John, if you read the Clark book, Kennedy in, I think, October of 1963 did a tour to the western states because these were strongholds for the Republicans. And he was doing, the theme was supposed to be conservation. And he wasn't all excited about that. He was more excited about getting the limited test ban treaty, the back channel negotiations with Khrushchev, and the possibility of opening it up with Castro. So when he went out west and he started talking about conservation, he said the audiences were somewhat bored. And so he shifted to how we've changed the relations with Russia. We've got a chance for peace, not just peace for now, but peace for all time, not just for America, but for all people. And the audiences went crazy. And he was convinced at that point, by the end of October, that this would be a winning strategy for the election. But he had trouble getting his advisors to go along with him. And in the midst of that, he's gunned down in Dallas. So all that we've talked about for a long time about the significance of the assassination and the cover-up, it's all there. So what if RFK Jr. chooses to make this a central issue of the 2024 campaign, as he said he's going to? As now Tulsi Gabbard is talking about it, as McGregor is talking about it. They need to fine-tune it a little bit. They really should study the writings of Lyndon LaRouche on these things. But I think we're not that far away from creating an upsurge against globalization. And by globalization, I mean the Schwab WEF form of globalization, as opposed to the idea of multilateralism, that countries coming together for common interests and mutual benefit. So I'm convinced the message is the right one. The problem is getting it out in this time of censorship and corrupt media and real greed and corruption of the political class. So that's how I see it. And that's what I would say as sort of an appendage to Douglas McGregor's comments.
You know, you mentioned times and events and people who are connected to my dad's life, and of course the creation of SACSA, the entity in the Pentagon that my dad worked for, was intended to take away from the CIA the power that it had been exerting to have basically quasi-military operations going on around the world, operations that got them in trouble in the Bay of Pigs. And President Kennedy decided to take it away from them. Well, I still think that revenge is a big motive for Allen Dulles and the CIA, and that might have, you know, that kind of a fire in the belly that you feel when you feel like you got to get this guy back. He had a target on his back, but it wasn't, of course, just from the CIA, and we've talked about that many times. The sad thing is that with the death of President Kennedy, the CIA was back in business, sending teams in. And, you know, I don't know if you've ever studied Operation Bright Light, but that's one of those things where they just took these hapless Vietnamese and other people and made them into special agents. And these often were prisoners that they had captured from the Viet Cong. And then they flip them and they send them on these what they call the Halo parachute drops, so you have to drop
Yeah.
all the way down to the bottom so you don't get shot before you land. And then they
Yeah.
were all turned, and it was just all of these crazy schemes that they with the SWATO boats and everything. All of these ideas coming out of military minds trying to fulfill the needs of the CIA during the 60s, because the CIA was given that order right there in that uh, action memorandum of the. And I always, when we cover that ground, it always just kind of strikes me as important to point out that in the State Department's records, if you read what they did on the day before Kennedy was died, they said the president this, and then after Kennedy dies, they say the president that. They don't identify the fact that the name of the president changed over those 24 hours. And to me, that's chilling. It tells me that they're thinking of the presidency as just one office in their bureaucracy that they control. And this secret team idea from Fletcher Prouty comes in strong. And here we are now. I think that their tentacles have gotten deeper and deeper and deeper, and their psychological control of the American people is amazing. Now, last Friday night, President Biden snuck through into the press an announcement that no, he's not going to release the last of the JFK files. And of course, Bobby Kennedy was incensed, and I hope that everybody's incensed. Now, taking on the financial system generally seems like a pretty hard thing to do. But if we could form a wedge of that issue and to say, President Biden, you're wrong. It's been well over 50 years. Anybody that's going to be embarrassed by this is long since dead. And we, the American people, have a right to know. We've got to know all the details. And if that takes down Alan Welsh Dulles, then who cares at this point? If that takes down major industry leaders, who cares? These the answer to the JFK riddle is going to open up the floodgates of all the things that you're speaking of.
That's exactly the point, John, because
yeah,
who else is it going to bring down? Not just people who are dead, people like Antony Blinken.
yeah,
What did Blinken do? Blinken set up this West exec think tank, made millions of dollars from war profiteering. Avril Haines, who's now the director of national intelligence, is part of that. You look at the what's her name, Susan Rice. You look at these networks who are part of these what are sometimes called private intelligence operations that are connected to the existing intelligence establishment. These are the people who are the ones that have to be brought down now. At this point, Alan Dulles is a useful figure to demonstrate where this started in the recent period and the continuity. But we've got to show that the people who are doing these corrupt deeds, who are profiting from the wiping out of the young population of Ukraine, because that's what they're doing. The idea of a proxy war means they're prepared to kill every single young person in Ukraine to try to effect a regime change in Russia. And you saw how excited they got over the Wagner so-called coup, which turned out to be nothing. And they're still, to this day, jumping up and down. This proves Putin is weak. This proves Putin is in terrible shape. It doesn't prove that at all. In fact, it's another failed intelligence operation by these guys who ultimately are bunglers. They can succeed with weak, poor nations. But taking on Russia, taking on China is a different situation. And part of that is that Russia and China have learned a lesson, which is that if you have economic policies that improve the standard of living of your population, you will sustain their support level. And with all this talk about how weak Putin is, the polls taken by Western pollsters show that Putin still has close to 70% support of the Russian people. And, they always say, well, that's because if you say you don't like him, you'll get shot. Well, we're not seeing a lot of people shot in Russia. It's just not happening. The Russian people are committed to this idea of maintaining their sovereignty. You look at polls taken in China, and the Chinese people are among the most happy in the world because they see a better future. They see a chance to let their children and grandchildren explore the heavens and travel the world, which now is increasingly less likely for American youth to be able to do. So, I think there is a huge shift in the world. We didn't even talk much about the Global South and the upcoming BRICS conference. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is meeting today in Delhi. Putin had a discussion with Modi before. This is going full speed ahead. And this is what the Anglo-Americans are trying to stop, this new order. Now, one of the dangers, and I'll be quick on this, one of the dangers is if we can't get Europe and the United States to drop their opposition to this and perhaps even join it, then the risk of war remains, because then you would have, as in the Orwell case, a do or die opposition to what's going to happen to the dollar and the dollar denominated assets. Well, that's a real risk for the Western bankers. They think they have the strength of the dollar. They don't realize they have the weakness of the dollar debt. And this is one of the things LaRouche kept saying to people like Lopez Portillo in Mexico, to the Brazilian leadership in 1982. He said, "You think you're weak because of the debt. That's your weapon. You can use the debt bomb to cancel the debt, and that will topple the people who are killing off your populations." And Lopez Portillo understood it, but he didn't remain in office much longer. His term was up. This was a real potential in 1982, 83, the beginning of the year, the debt bomb. So you think they don't know that today? I don't know if you saw the interview or if you saw the event in Paris where Macron was trying to convince the African leaders that a European green tax would allow them to go to carbon neutral energy sources and so on. And African leader after African leader said, "We don't want that." The president of Kenya said, "Why should we allow the IMF and the World Bank to handle the funds for this?" The president of Zambia said, "Why should we trust you? You keep promising things and it never happens." And then Ramaphosa from South Africa said, "Look, we're looking at alternative systems that will actually allow the development." And then Lula came in, and Lula said that Ramaphosa made a proposal for the Great Inga Dam, which would solve the problem of no electricity for 600 million Africans. And the question was posed, what are you in Europe going to do to provide electricity to 600 million Africans who have no access to electricity? With solar power and wind power, it's not going to happen. And so this idea of the great hydroelectric dam connected with a network of nuclear power plants, that's where Africa is headed. So this is where the Western financial system is not so strong. In fact, it's the one that's facing the question of its own extinction. That's our flank.
Africa. The Schiller Institute has done a great deal of work to educate people as to what you just said, Harley, and I appreciated that. I have a couple of booklets that were published by your organization that go right into the details of that. And people need to realize that wind power and solar is just not going to get it. And the African leaders that you spoke of have figured it out, and they see that it's not going to get it. And furthermore, I think to keep treating them as if they needed handouts is finally
Yeah, they said, "We don't want to be beggars. You're turning us into beggars."
yeah.
And that's not what we want. And another one said, "Look, you're worried about immigration. If you push through this green transaction tax, you're not going to improve Africa. You're going to have a whole new series of boatloads of immigrants coming to your shores."
Well, Harley, I think what I've decided to do is to create a policy that, number one, Social Security will not be ever is inviolate. Number two, everybody's pension is guaranteed. And number three, everything else is a jubilee. Nobody owes anybody anything. The corporations can go pound sand. We don't care. You know, the courts are now disempowered to award judgments based upon past debts. There is no way that you can avoid the jubilee that is necessary to clear the boards and allow our countries to get back to their missions as sovereign countries. A sovereign country cannot be indebted to a foreign bank in a foreign capital and with the resources of that country, security interests for that loan. That's got to stop. These crazy political machinations that control people generation after generation in little what people deserve the ability to start fresh. And it's an ancient right that has existed since biblical times,
Yeah.
that a sovereign nation has the power, inherent power, to regulate whether to just discharge all the debts. And if we're not going to, strap up our get our gumption together and force these banks into a bankruptcy procedure, then I think maybe the answer is a bill that just somehow protects people's life savings and expectations for retirement, while at the same time relieving everybody of these incredibly unpayable debts. I mean, my God, what is it, $40 trillion now? And
Well, that's the official figure, and that's government debt. We're talking about almost the same size now of corporate and private debt.
all right, Harley. Well, we're going to uncover the last hidden parts of the JFK files, and we're going to relieve everybody of these debts, and so it shall be. What do you think?
And celebrate the 4th of July. That's why where we started today with the discussion.
All right. Happy Fourth, everyone. Happy Fourth, Harley, and thank you very much. Very intriguing and delightful to talk to you once again, and I look forward to the next time. Bye,
Okay.
everyone.